Alright, I thought we'd start this week off by just doing a review of how Latin uses the subjunctive and all the different ways we've learned that the subjunctive can be used so far. And this is an important thing to go over again and again and again because it's really easy to forget some of these different ways the subjunctive is used. And as soon as we forget certain meanings and ways we can translate the subjunctive, we start being unable to translate sentences properly. So, let's remind ourselves. First, there's two kinds of subjunctives. First, there are independent uses of the subjunctive. That is, when the subjunctive is used inside a main clause and not a subordinate clause. And we'll talk about subordinate uses of the subjunctive usages that fall inside subordinate clauses in a minute. Let's start with independent ones. Alright, so, independent uses of the subjunctive. There's no subordinate clauses here, they're just subjunctives that appear in a main clause or in a sentence and you have no idea what to do with them. A couple different kinds. First, there's hortatory subjunctives. Remember that hortor means to encourage or exhort. So hortatory is an act of encouragement or exhortation. Good example, one that I always learned and memorized, is eamus ad urbem. Let us go to the city. Right? We call it hortatory when it occurs in the first person plural because it's something that, an encouragement that we are giving to each other. Eamus ad urbem. Let us go to the city. Closely related to this is something called the jussive use of the subjunctive. Rex ad urbem eat. Let the king go to the city. And you'll see jussives in second and third person. And really the only difference here between hortatory and jussive is who we're talking about. A jussive feels more like this command, let this be allowed. The hortatory is an exhortation to a group, let us do this thing. The other one that Dickey spends a lot of time talking about in the textbook is deliberative uses of the subjunctive, and these are those rhetorical questions. Eamus ne ad urbem, should we go to the city? And then we have to decide whether or not we want to go, or whether or not that was even a question that's meant to be answered, or something we're just supposed to think on. Finally, there's two other independent uses of the subjunctive that we've talked about briefly in class a couple of times. Dickey doesn't spend any time going into this in the textbook, but it's just good to know that they exist. The subjunctive can also be used to express a potential or a wish, which we sometimes call the optative. So an example of an optative would be utinami eamus ad urbem. Would that we may go to the city. It's a way of expressing this potentiality in the future. May this happen? Or potential, ad urbem eamus, we might go to the city. And notice, you've got number one, a hortatory eamus ad urbem, let us go, versus a potential ad urbem eamus. How do we differentiate the two? Well, this is where subjunctives get a little complicated in independent uses. Potentials could appear all over the place. We really just need to look at what the context is. So potential uses of the subjunctive are very flexible and occur in lots and lots of different places. The one potential you've already seen so far is when we see wishes expressed by velim instead of volo. It's a way of trying to be more polite. We might wish to do this thing instead of saying, I wish to do this thing. Alright, these we're a lot more comfortable with as soon as we go to dependent uses of the subjunctive, because our dependent uses of the subjunctive are always going to have a subordinating conjunction introducing them, most often ut and ne. So first off, we have purpose. Purpose introduced by ut, ne in the negative, it's translated as in order to. These we see all the time. In fact, as soon as you see an ut clause plus a subjunctive, this is the first kind of clause you should think of. It'd be my default in my mind. I see ut plus the subjunctive. Oh, this is probably a purpose clause, right? And so we have this lovely example. Rex urbem upugnavit ut vinceret. The king attacked the city in order to conquer it. Then we get two other kinds of subjunctives we've talked about. Once again, they both use ut and ne, and they both have specific types of verbs that introduce the clauses. And this is what's going to help us when we see ut and ne, plus the subjunctive to help us figure out what kind of clauses they are. Purpose clauses, automatically we'll assume it's purpose unless we have verb of commanding. And then we have an indirect command. So as in example 2a here, Rex imperavit ut milites urbem obpugnarant. The king commanded that the soldiers attack the city. right? Fear clauses. Once again, we're looking for that verb of fearing to introduce it. The funny thing about fear clauses is you get the nay and oot switched. And remember, I always try to remind lest, right? Lest, that, not. So, 3a. The king fears lest the city be attacked. If we switch the nay to oot, it would just be the king fears that the city not be attacked. And finally, result clauses. Result are different because instead of using oot and nay, it uses oot and oot known. The nice thing about result clauses, first, if you have oot known in a clause plus a subjunctive, you're just going to say, okay, this is the result. Got it, moving on. Next, result clauses have those fun keywords, tom, eta, audeo, talis, tontus, all those words like that. If you need to review those, go through that section again, look through those again. So once again, the difference. 1a, the king attacked the city in order to conquer it. 4a, the king attacked the city in this manner with the result that he conquered it. And so notice the difference in between those two sentences is just the simple word eta, which is helping us see that the sentence is going in a different direction. So be very careful with those adverbs. These keywords are really important. So review those if you don't remember that whole list. Alright, last week, as a review once again, we introduced cum clauses with the subjunctive, and then we had to talk about an entire sequence of tenses. So with the 4 previous uses of the subjunctive that we had, they've all occurred at the same time. So it hasn't been that hard. So if it's a primary sequence verb in the main clause, we use the present subjunctive in the subordinate clause. And if it's a secondary sequence verb in the main clause, we use an imperfect subjunctive in the subordinate clause. It's pretty simple. But when we add cum clauses, we have to look at prior time as well. So as a reminder, primary sequence in prior time uses the perfect subjunctive. Secondary sequence in prior time uses the pluperfect subjunctive. I just wanted to throw out these sentences again as a quick reminder of the different ways we can translate these if you did have this cum clause because he is inheriting it in Latin. Alright, so primary sequence, same time, he visits the house because he is inheriting it. Both actions occur in the present. Secondary sequence, same time, he visited the house because he was inheriting it. We move to the past, and both actions once again are occurring at exactly the same time. If we move into prior time, it gets just a little bit more complicated. So primary sequence, the action has to occur in the present, but the subordinate clause occurs in the past. So he visits the house because he has inherited it. And if we move to historic sequence, prior time, he visited the house in the past, and then we have to mark that that prior action occurred even further back in the past, so we need to use the word had, because he had inherited it. So, practice learning that chart. Go over it a couple more times. Quick reminder with cum clauses. When cum serves as a conjunction, it can mean when, since, or although. Cum plus the indicative always just means when. So you got to really know the difference between your indicative and subjunctive verb endings. When we use cum plus the indicative, sometimes you'll hear these clauses called cum temporal clauses. Cum plus the subjunctive is a little harder. It can mean since or because. It's called a cum causal clause. It can mean although, which is a cum concessive clause, or sometimes it can mean when, which we call a cum circumstantial clause. Notice we have these 3 C's: causal, concessive, circumstantial. What you need to remember, when I see cum plus the subjunctive, I would always just default to because or since. If it's a cum concessive clause, typically you'll have an adverb like tamen, helping you understand that this is a concessive clause, or the rest of the context will make it very clear that this needs to be taken in a concessive manner. It will just make sense. Because won't, although will. Finally, when. Cum circumstantial clauses, just a reminder, cum temporal tells you when this happened, Y occurred. The 2 events are clearly connected. Circumstantial clauses are not connected. When Caesar was crossing the Alps, I found gold. right? It tells me a general period of time, but there's no connection between the two occurrences in any way, shape, or form, right? The example I used before is when Columbus was trying to cross to India, he discovered America. They're not related. He didn't intend to do that thing. It's the general circumstances of what were happening. And so once again, let context be your guide. Try since or because, especially for these practice sentences, just default to that unless there's this word like tamen that really pushes you towards although. And then when circumstantial, a good way of thinking of those for now is use them when because or although doesn't make sense, where it just gives you a better meaning. And this is something you'll just have to practice as you keep getting better at Latin. So I hope that quick